Today we welcome former Olympic rower on the Canadian team in 1988 in Seoul, South Korea, Jason Dorland, who is also an author and a man who is working on teaching and coaching and peak performance and getting into the zone, which is what it's all about. Also happens to be the husband of our recent guest on our show, Robin Marr, who is a longtime a Canadian national team track and field member and a two-time Olympian in her own right. And Jason, I think it would be fair to characterize your approach and your wife's approach initially in competition as polar opposites, but you not only had a matrimonial meeting of the hearts, but you had a meeting of the mind. So take us back to the genesis of your original approach to competition in sports, and we'll get into how it evolved from there, please.
Yeah, right. I think, you pretty much nailed it. Our approaches were polar opposite. And in terms of the mental approach, Robin's approach was a stark contrast from mine. Mine was a win at all costs approach. And I refer to it as a combative approach now, where my competition was seen as the enemy and someone to be beaten, and in fact, someone to be killed. If I'm going to use the verbiage that we would have used at the time, and that was what I learned as a young athlete. It's what I was coached, and it's what I knew, and therefore it's what I used. I won't say it didn't work. It did for a long time. It worked all the way through high school, through university, on to the national team. And I guess it wasn't until it didn't work, where it failed on the world stage in our Olympic finals, that I was really forced to have a hard look at what I was using to motivate myself as an elite athlete.
What do you think changed from the positive results and success that you experienced, embracing the old paradigm of winning isn't everything, it's the only thing, and conquest and testosterone-fueled domination, not just victory in competition, to the more evolved, if you will, view that your wife embraced, but you changed? What was the catalyst to that, and why was the first approach successful at some point early in your career and in your life, and suddenly it wasn't working for you anymore?
Yeah. Wow. Good question. Well, after Seoul in 1988, I made an attempt at coming back, and I took a year off and decided that returning to the 92 Olympics would be a way to fix what happened in Seoul, right? To prove that was a mistake, that I was worthy, that we were worthy. All of the sort of ego-centered approaches to competition that one might utilize, right? And so redemption and revenge were huge sources of fuel for me. And when I would train, I would think about the Germans and the Americans and the Russians and every country that was in that final, and how I was going to prove to the world that we were capable of winning. And my training was really enraged more than the first time going to Seoul. And for the first 6 months, this revenge thing worked really, really well. And my training was on fire. I was lifting more weights than I had been before we left for Seoul. My fitness was returning. I was rowing really well, and I was genuinely excited. And I thought I had sort of latched onto this fuel that was going to take me to Barcelona and give me back my sense of worth, right? This sense of being. And wow, 6 months into it, it crashed in a big way. The anger that I was experiencing on the water was now sort of consuming me, if you will. And who I was on the water was becoming who I was all the time, which was just angry. And there were a number of events and things that transpired where I realized that I wasn't going to last 3 years in this body, right? With this approach. And I don't know that I had a choice. I think it was either it was sort of self-preservation that kicked in and just said, Jason, you are not going to make this, right? You are going to. This is a pretty ugly path. And so I retired from the sport and began what we now refer to as athlete transition. It was pretty textbook. Some dark stuff, right? Depression, eating disorder, working a training regimen that was obsessive compulsive, and just a loss of identity, right? If I wasn't a rower, then who was I? And that was I didn't have an answer to that, right? And it was 1989, 1990, and we didn't talk about stuff like that. There were no sports psychs that we could call up. We were left to our own devices, and my devices weren't healthy. And when I met Robin, I was, not at the bottom, but I was had just hit bottom, and I was sort of coming back up. And when I watched her race and learned that her approach was not anything that mine had been, that hers was about a journey and enjoying running and embracing competitors as friends and people to work with, it was just the most ridiculous and absurd thing I'd ever heard before. And so in terms of the fix, if you will, in terms of this education that I got from this remarkable young woman, it wasn't an overnight thing, right? It happened over a number of years as we continued to date. And I just watched this very graceful athlete sort of weave in and out of international competitions, either winning or losing, and neither outcome defining her, right? Whether she lost or won, she was still the same person. And I was just amazed at that, right? That you could lose an international event, come second or third, lose in my world, and still find something of worth in that, right? It was so foreign to me. And so, what are we, 6 years into it, 7 years into it, I returned to coaching. And I just realized that I wasn't going to be the coach of how I was coached, and I was determined to embrace Robin's approach, and away we went.
And when you say the anger that was fueling your redemption efforts to get to Barcelona and win a medal in the '92 games spilled over into your private life, into who you were as a person, not just as a rower. Do you believe if you would compartmentalize things better, you would have been able to continue to fuel the fires of competition? Or did you think it got to the core of actually undermining your efforts, and it just was a revelation that came to you later when it did spill into your personal life?
That's an interesting question. I think, it became my undoing. As powerful as redemption can be and anger can be, I mean, sure, they're powerful motivators, but the wick is really short, right? It's a short fuse. And mine was 6 months, and I think if I had, in terms of regrets, first of all, I wouldn't have made it. I truly don't believe I would have lasted 3 years if I could have found a strategy to sort of, as you say, to compartmentalize it, so that when I came off the water, I could sort of leave that person at the dock. I just don't feel that I could have. I certainly wasn't able to at the time. I think for me, what it ultimately became, sort of the final kick in the ass was that Canada went on to win in '92, right? They went back and won that Olympic medal, and guys who were in my crew were part of that boat. And wow, the day that they won, it was not a day of celebration for me. embarrassed to admit, but I've long admitted that, that I was furious when Canada won because I wasn't part of that crew.
Right.
Do I believe I could have been? You bet, physically for sure, but emotionally, I just wasn't in a place to have been a part of that team.
Well, that's a hard reality that smacked you right in the face. And as bittersweet, you must be rooting for your teammates and, being grateful and supportive of them, but feeling that you missed out for whatever reason, that you didn't get it in time to experience.
Sure.
That must
for sure.
really challenge.
And I just think, but that's the ego, right? And that's when we let our egos drive the bus. The cliff shows up pretty quick. At least it did in my instance. And some of these guys were close friends, but I couldn't celebrate their accomplishment. It was all about me. It was what I had lost out on, and what I lost out on was my moment on the world stage with a gold medal around my neck. And
right. Talk more about the ego being somewhat the enemy of self-actualization and the manifestation for an athlete and as a person beyond sports.
Right. And I think that's where the cool part of Robin's approach, that's where the power in that way, in that fuel, really shows its strength. In that, one of the key parts of our coaching now is to help people turn on to utilizing their soul as their fuel, right? As a form of motivation, as opposed to the ego. So the ego involves things that are outside of us, extrinsic, tangible things often, right? So either medals or trophies or awards or what have you, or comparisons, being better than, not being a loser. That's all egoic. And Robin's whole gig was that she just loved running. She loved how running made her feel, and the result of that was her high performance. And so I think what we try to do now as coaches is to have people try to move from an egoic form of motivation to one that's more centered in the soul, one that is an intrinsic experience of motivation.
Robin talked about stop focusing on the outcome and embrace the moment. Bill Walsh, the great coach of the San Francisco 49ers, who I had the privilege of covering for 25 years as their sideline reporter for most of those years and the pre and post game 49ers talk show host on the flagship station, wrote a book called The Score Will Take Care of Itself, focusing on the process, not the end game.
Yeah.
And it really parallels your sharing with us today.
Yeah, it's beautiful. It's perfect. I mean, my expression is you get the performance you deserve, right? So some people think it's a harsh comment, but when I look back at our final in Seoul, when I'm truly honest with myself about the preparation, the things that happened in the days leading up to it, the result makes sense to me now. At the time, not at all. When I look at the crews that I've coached and the results they've garnered, it sort of makes sense. We took care of the process, right? We turned over every stone that we could imagine and made sure that we were doing as much as we could. Even in races where we came second or third, those were still performances that were exceptional. We just happened to show up on race day and meet a crew that was better than us. And that's okay. That's what sport is, right? You can't control how good your competition is. All you can do is show up and take care of your own performance. So, I totally agree that you focus on the controllables, and the end game, the end result will be what it should be ultimately.
Now, how do you go about imparting that wisdom to young athletes who may have just embraced that? Again, the old paradigm is you've got to crush your opponent. What is that old line in football? Is it you impose your will, and it's a very macho machismo mentality that has prevailed in many realms beyond sports, in business and in national conflicts, international conflicts, and the like. So tell me about how you changed that paradigm to a young aspiring athlete to get him to embrace a new path, which may not be the first, at first blush, instinctually, he wouldn't gravitate to it instinctually.
Yeah, no, fair. And again, good question. It's and it is the work, right? I mean, how do you try to introduce a way of being to anybody? Forget about a teenage athlete or a young athlete who for a good chunk of their lives perhaps have existed solely in their ego, right? Especially young teenage boys. The whole world is about ego, and so when I would come in, this last coaching experience I had at a school in Southern Ontario, when I introduced myself to the boys and said, look, my job here is to try and build a culture of love. I mean, you can imagine the looks, right? It was, what is this guy on about? But love, what is that? And, I just said, look, the whole point of this is to try for us to instill love in this program so that, so it's about love for self, love for the endeavor, love for team, and ultimately love for the competition. And again, it's not a light switch process, right? It takes time. You introduce the thought, the idea, the sentiment of where you want to move to, and then through consistent dialogue and showing up the same way every time, every day, you build trust. They start to see how that approach starts to garner them improved results, and then you get buy-in. And then once you've got that buy-in, you can really take off. But it's really building the trust of the athlete to say, for them to first acknowledge that you're not crazy, and that this might actually be a competitive strategy. And that's really how I try to package it, that this approach, this culture of love will actually allow you or help you win more races. When you have that conversation, perhaps they feel more at ease to come to the table and engage.
So you have a psychological shift that has a physical and biological manifestation. Have you been able to either quantify it or identify it, or in some way affirm what you've believed and what you say?
I wouldn't, everything's been anecdotal, but like I said, I guess the success is sort of the proof, right? I mean,
right.
When you consistently win national and international championships, utilizing a philosophy that's about love, it's kind of hard to argue the results, right? And yeah, at first there was a lot of teasing, and I was the butt of a lot of jokes within the rowing world when the word got out that Dorland was a coach that didn't talk about winning and everything was about process, and then when the word love started to come into it, oh baby, look out, right? And but I didn't care. I was doing what I was hired to do, which was win schools championships. But more importantly to me, I was providing an experience that helped transform the lives of young men. And I'm a big fan of making the goal bigger than winning, right? And for me, that's inherently the ticket for the coach, right? Is if you see your job is to win banners on walls, then not only are you missing the point of this, but you're setting yourself up to underperform. So I believe in setting goals bigger than winning, which ultimately have to deal with the lives of the young athletes you're working with, and the results then, in most likelihood, may involve winning more often.
Right. Well, they're not mutually exclusive, right? I mean, you can be enhanced in your thinking and lifestyle and perform well. In fact, maybe they are aligned and joined at the hip, if you will. So when you meet resistance and try to impart this new paradigm, what are some of the mechanisms? What are some of the tools that you use to get the message across initially.
Yeah, just quickly, Rich, back to that comment about joined at the hip. I totally believe that. Right now, often when we go in and give our workshops, and there'll be a coach in there who's, not necessarily buying in, and they see it as an either or. Right, you're either going to try and win, or you're going to coach in a holistic approach that is about the well-being of the athlete. But I agree with what you've said, that it isn't either or. It's one. That they are a package, right? You take care of the athlete, and they'll achieve a higher level of performance. So, yeah, it's perfect what you just said there. In terms of implementing, again, I just don't see it as a list. Perhaps no surprise when you're going to engage the being of someone, right? The soul of someone. It involves relationships, and for me, it is all about building the relationship. That's the piece, right? If when people have asked, how and why your crews have been so successful, I don't know more about coaching rowing than the other coaches. Our boats aren't any better. We don't train necessarily different. I think what I've been able to utilize is my ability to relate to the athletes. That's the piece. They let me into their lives. They trust me. And from that trust, we create a really big why. And for a why for them to come to practice, a why for them to race as hard as they race, a why for them to eat properly, to get sleep. But all of it stems from the relationship. If it was as easy as just handing out textbooks and saying, this is how you win a national championship, or this is how you win an Olympic gold medal, well, then everyone would do it, right? This is the art of coaching. This is the human piece. And that's what makes those medals mean so much, is because they're elusive. And why they're elusive is because of that human touch, right? It's that ability to come in and impact somebody on a deeper level than just X and O's and technique and training and what have you. So, sorry, that doesn't really answer your question, but that's kind of my thing.
It does. It reminds me of the messages that Phil Jackson was using through so many years as a NBA championship coach, first with Michael Jordan's Chicago Bulls and then Kobe Bryant with the LA Lakers, and a guy who couldn't get a job in the NBA as a coach for so long because he was viewed as too much in the vein that you spoke of. He's the Zen Buddhist guy, and how is that going to fly in the ultra uber competitive NBA? Well, he just retired a few years ago from coaching with 11 rings, more than the great Red Auerbach. And he was extolling the same virtues and message and philosophy of this tribal community of a team that I'm getting from you.
Yeah, and I think the people that get it, right? It's just I can't imagine going back to coaching the other way, the older way. Not only because I just couldn't do that because I know of the carnage that can be left, but also it's a limited strategy. This is the best strategy for high performance. So why would I go back to a combative method that involves shame and ego and the fear of losing and all that sort of stuff? It doesn't make sense to me from a strategic point as well.
I heard one of your talks and you said one of the big lies is, in order to be happy, we must achieve lofty goals. Expound on that, if you would.
Yeah. Well, I just think it's the culture we grow up in, right? It's the human doing versus the human being. And I think so much of our worth in North America is based on the things we do and what we accomplish and what we have. And I fell into that, right? I mean, I went after an Olympic gold medal because of what I thought it would do for me, of what I thought it would make me. And wow, was I ever wrong? I mean, Michael Phelps for me is the poster child for that illusion that Olympic gold medals bring us something, right? They bring us happiness or worth or a sense of accomplishment. Sure, it's look, don't get me wrong. It's wonderful and it's amazing to win an Olympic gold medal. I'm sure. I can't speak from experience, but I know a lot of Olympic gold medalists, and it's a beautiful thing. But it doesn't bring what many people think it does bring, which is this sense of, okay, I'm complete, right? There's no completion in our lives, right? We are always traveling. And the thing about Michael was that, if winning 18 Olympic gold medals doesn't bring you joy and fulfillment, then what? 19 would have? I don't get that, right? I mean, what I find so inspiring was that, after London, when he had some struggles, he found a different reason to come back and swim, and now has left the sport and is thriving. So as a husband and a father and a person, and to me that is an example of he figured out a better reason, a bigger reason to compete that wasn't about his ego. And I think when athletes figure that piece out, they not only become better athletes, but they become better people.
Now, obviously, external validation is noble. I mean, if you achieve a great feat, everyone would want to say, well, hats off to you, congratulations. What a true manifestation of a tremendous journey. But it's not the be-all and the end-all. I love your quote, love outperforms grit every time. And you always hear people say, you got to want it so bad you could taste it. Roger Craig, the 3-time Super Bowl running back of the 49ers, said to me, you can't play hungry, you got to play like you're starving. And I get his old school mentality to be driven to that absolute, nth degree. But you give a whole new look to it.
Yeah, I don't, look, grit's important. Stick-to-itiveness, for sure. You got to have athletes who can push through some of the ugly days and keep going. But, my question around the grit piece is what's fueling the grit, right? And that's where love comes in. If love is the fuel, look out. Like, that's where the magic happens. But if the grit is fueled through ego and wanting to achieve worth and achieve status and, on, then, like I said, it will work, but it's a limited fuel. And whereas love, it's not only powerful, but it sustains and it gets stronger. So I think, and it doesn't matter what the field is, whether it's corporate, whether it's sports, it just doesn't matter. When we connect with a purpose that speaks to our soul, that we can utilize love, that's a whole different gig, right? That's a life worth living. And from that, we experience a higher level of performance, regardless of what it looks like, right?
So you're talking not just the love of the endeavor, the love of the experience, the love of the teammates. It's an all-encompassing aspect to the endeavor.
Yeah, but and sometimes this is the hardest piece. It starts with the love for self, and that's where you get tricky with athletes. Is some of the most insecure people you'd ever want to meet are athletes, because their self-worth is wrapped up in their performance, and it starts at a young age. It did for me. What I realized as a young boy was that when I performed well, adults talked about me, right? They talked about me differently. And so I wanted to do more of that, right? When I noticed that my teachers and my parents and my coaches and my older siblings would talk about me in public gatherings, that was a pretty cool experience, right? And when you're a young kid, you think, wow, I want to have that more. And so you start to push yourself and drive yourself to achieve higher levels of performance to garner greater acknowledgement. So your worth lives outside of you. And so that's how that pattern, that's how that that internal mode of operation begins. It did for me anyhow. And that's why I think as athletes, the self-love piece is so important, because if you can love yourself, regardless of the outcome, then you're in a higher, you set yourself up for higher performance. One of the things I always say to athletes or executives that I'm working with, for an athlete, for example, given we're talking about sport, when they go into a final championship or an important match or race, I try to make the point, look, there's a high probability that you could win this race, right? But then there's also the probability that you might not. If you can live with both outcomes, and if you can be okay with both outcomes, then you'll set yourself up for a higher probability of a better performance. And so when you can let go of that result, when it won't define who you are and how you feel about yourself, that's a better strategy, right? But again, that's not a light switch. That takes some time, and it takes it comes back to that relationship with coaches and with adults and the people in the lives of those athletes.
Right. So the external validation could actually undermine self-actualization.
Oh, for sure. No doubt. It is it's Tim Gallway, if you're familiar with his work. I mean, that equation that he has, right? Potential or performance equals potential minus interference. That's a huge interference, right? If your self-worth is attached to your performance, then you're in big trouble. That's why I like to encourage athletes to have that self-worth before you enter the performance, right? To be good with who you are before you step on the playing field. That regardless of winning or losing, you still feel good about who you are. And when you can be in that place, when you can be that athlete, you're gonna perform better, and chances are you're gonna win more games.
And be a happier person to boot.
No doubt. And that is the paradox, Rich, for many people, that we have bought into this world of, if you win, you're a winner. If you lose, you're dirt. And so, often the job of a coach is to undo that programming and to reprogram it with, that's garbage. You're worth something, before you go on the field, right? Your family loves you. I love you, whatever, right? You are loved, and you don't have to win today in order to feel loved, right? That's the ideal container for every athlete.
Well, what's the Latin derivation of competition is to strive together. Yeah. And in a way, we need an opponent to find out what we're made of. But at the same time, it doesn't define us. The outcome doesn't define us. The competition is what reveals where we are at a given time, at a given moment. Sure. Jason, fascinating to get to hear your thoughts, and congratulations on your ascension from the old paradigm to the new, and keep on doing the good work to enlighten others with your coaching and your teachings. Jason Dorland, thanks for joining us today.
My pleasure. Thank you.